Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday live stream, where we're going to be continuing the conversation about permaculture design. Specifically, today, I want to continue on the conversation that we began about base maps and the zone model of permaculture, and this time move into talking about sectors and vectors. One of these I'm sure that you've likely heard before is the idea of sectors, and sectors are the resources and energies that come through a site and can include sun, wind, and water, as well as people and animals. And they include any really kind of economic, social, biological, or any combination thereof of influences on a site. Every sector can be mapped and ultimately have a needs, yields, waste, and relationships analysis performed upon it, something I'll need to include in a future conversation on design is to talk about that analysis. The other phrase that I use today is vectors, which was something that was introduced to me during my permaculture design course. And as far as I know, Ben Weiss and Dylan Cruz are the only permaculture instructors that I know to use that language, but it was something that struck with me. And in their context, that word of vector means something that we want to try to mitigate its influence on our site. When I think of designing for disasters, that's where this idea of vectors come in, is that those disasters or crises that might come through a site are a negative influence that we might want to try to mitigate. Though, this could also be something like people walking through a property and wanting to move them in a particular way through it, or if we find that we have animals on site that are raiding our garden, such as deer or groundhogs, something like fencing can be something to help mitigate them. And, something that I like about this model is that we can use it with the zones and change the way that we might think about something as it moves through our site. Because there are some areas where, if we're setting up a garden to teach children, or as an educational space, then it would be very appropriate to have people in those areas, and so we might not consider them a vector there. But if we have large animals or something that we want to keep away from people, then that interaction might be something that we would wish to mitigate. So one of the things that we have from last time to work from when it comes to this sector and vector analysis is our base map. And as I said last time, we worked something together, worked up what this looks like. And then what I like to do once I have this done is to just go ahead and take a picture of whatever I might have drawn by hand and then, throw it on my computer, make a printout of it, and then I have copies of it that I can use then to mark up further. And can take all these ideas that we might brainstorm from a sector analysis and be able to add it directly to a relatively fresh and clean map. So let's go ahead and grab a clean page here on the notebook and talk about the potential sectors that we might have on this home scale permaculture site. And this is one of those places where I think that, our idea of observation and interaction are really important within permaculture. Because we need to spend time on a site in order to see what the influences might be, not just during a particular day or a particular season, but throughout the year. And if this is something that we're not able to do directly as permaculture designers, because maybe we're only brought in for a short period on a project, to work with a homeowner to know what kind of influences they have on the site over time, throughout the year. Even though we might be able to look at climate maps and weather forecasts and have an idea of what the precipitation for an area might be, that we can use the direct experience of our time on the land and with the homeowner or someone else in order to get a better idea of what things look like over time. We may be able to say, okay, this area gets so many inches of rain or rainfall equivalent of a year throughout a year, but what does it look like when that moisture pools somewhere on the property? And again, that's another place where our base maps are really important, and to have multiple copies of those after we do an initial assessment, because then we can sit down with a homeowner and discuss, or a site owner, and talk through where they find a lot of moisture, where they find a lot of resources settling in a property throughout the year. So then what we might think of for some of the influences on a site over time, there is, of course, sun, wind. Most areas will get, some form of rain or precipitation. I also, because of living in temperate climates, like to include snow on that list. I like to think about then people who are going to be coming and going, perhaps the people who live there. If it is an educational site, then wanting to look at who might be coming in as volunteers, as teachers, to know who they are and what their roles might be. So people, and potentially want to think about roles when we're doing this. We'll probably want to do a plant assessment, an animal assessment. For those of you who are here while this is live, are there any resources that you might think would come through a home site that you would want to add to this list of sectors? With where this particular site is that we're using as the example, I know that there are forests nearby, so we may have to deal with wildfires. There's also the stream that I noted in our map last time. And from conversations with the folks who live there, I know that this stream is one that is likely to overflow. And so there is a flooding risk that comes from this. And so I can list flooding here. When I do a plant analysis, I like to consider the plants that are already there as well as the plants that someone might want to add to the site. So that will be existing and additional. For animal, I like to consider wildlife as well as domesticated. And within that domesticated, that might be if someone wants to raise chickens on their property, that we'll want to take that into consideration, though we may also want to consider any house pets that they have, even though we may want to, if they have, cats or something like that, think of those animals primarily as an indoor pet. There is a possibility for them to be in the environment, so how would we consider that as well? Animals, wildfires, flooding. Is there anything else that you would consider to add to this? For me, I also like to include energy, both natural and man-made, because when it comes to energy, we can use pumps to move water around on a site, which can change the way that we have the resources available to us. And so including this in the conversation kind of builds this up and expands on what we have available to us and how we can, as we work through a sector analysis and all of these different pieces, the ways, again, how we can mitigate or make use of them as we start applying the principles of permaculture to something like this. And so, when I think about people, there's also, because in front of the home is a road, so I'm thinking about traffic. I may want to include, because there are road crews that come through, construction could be something that we need to be concerned about. And knowing the area and spending time in this space, there are farm fields around this site, so do I have to worry about pesticides, herbicides, or other chemicals. And then, as I mentioned, there's this idea within my particular permaculture education of vectors, of things that I might want to try to mitigate as issues arise, or in order to try to be aware of them before they might become some kind of a problem. Some of those that I think about are wildfires, flooding. Of course, I think about these chemical influences. What could traffic or construction do? And then I also want to look at animals, plants. And then with this site and the way that it was used over time, and from information from the people that lived there, the normal concerns that I might think about when it comes to people on a more public site don't necessarily apply here. There aren't many folks who tend to come out and walk through the land, though there is the stream that is mentioned in the map that I made is used for trout fishing. Generally, the people who come to trout fish do not walk through this yard in order to get to the stream, even though there is an allowance for public access here. It is limited to a few times a year and not something that the homeowners generally report as a problem. And so then now that I've got all of this here, I can go back to my map and begin to start kind of, putting some of these pieces in. And so when I look at something like the sun, I want to think about where the solar angles are. And so this home is located in central Pennsylvania. Let me grab a little bit of information real quick. And so this home site is located near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is at 40.27 degrees north. And I can use this latitude information based on a formula that Peter Bain gave in his book, The Permaculture Handbook, to calculate what my sun angles are going to be throughout the year. And so for this, the equinox equals 90 minus latitude. The summer solstice sun elevation is going to be equal to the equinox plus 23.5, and the winter solstice is going to equal the equinox minus 23.5 degrees. So we're going to find then if the angle here is 40.27. Let me double check real quick. So then the equinox elevation here is going to be 49.73 degrees. The summer solstice is going to be 73.23. And then the winter is going to be 26.23 degrees. And so then if I had my handy dandy compass, we'd be able to map this out so that the approximate sun angles will look something like this. Apparently throughout the year. If this is directly overhead, we're 90 degrees, and then we've got our 0 over here. And so, of course, the sun will never be completely directly overhead throughout the year, but rather will rise just up at an angle over the property. And then that lets me know, approximately where it's going to fall throughout the year over this site, and give me an idea then of, as it rises east to west directly, we've got, because this is not completely oriented, that my east to west will run something like this as the sun moves over the site. And then, of course, because we have our minimal angle, it'll be kind of like this during the winter and come in kind of more like that, apparently, during the summer. And then, of course, during the winter, that's going to push anything that's here on the northern side or the non-sunward side. We're going to have much longer shadows throughout the winter, which will change where we might want to place things throughout the year. Whereas, during the summer, even though it won't come directly overhead, that we'll have more sun exposure and push those shadows down more a bit towards the south. But then as I look at, I have got sun here due to observation. I know that, and then I can mark these for sun. Sun and sun. Because of the valley that this home site sits in, I am aware that even though, of course, the wind, because of storms and the way that it changes throughout the year, the winds do come from different directions throughout the year, but the prevailing winds here do come from the west to the east. And so much of the wind winds up, there's a road here. And then almost all of my wind here comes in from this side. Now, because there are trees here, they act as a windbreak. The home acts as a windbreak. This building here doesn't, much to my knowledge, but then these willows do. And so I might want to map out that there are calm areas here that don't necessarily get much wind, but that the majority of this that is felt is along this space. And so we have our winds through here. And that's where, as I look at this and it gets a little bit cluttered, I can grab another one of the maps that I have and start looking at wind. So I can just throw one here, sun angle and wind, and have that for later use. So then I can do wind. For a wind sector, and indicate that it blows in, but that it's relatively calm, breezy. And then on here, when it comes to rain, as I say, rain's going to kind of fall everywhere, but where might we collect some of this based on where the downspouts are coming from the house? And so knowing that there's one here and one here, one here and one here, that then again I can go back, since this is in a different color, grab my colored pencils and then start looking at water. So of course we've got our stream here. and then start mapping in where some of these water flows are. And so if we've got our downspout here, that it is positioned and flows this way, we have a downspout here that flows water this way. And this is here. And then as we look at this, and again, spending time on site, walking around, as this water flows out, does it pool anywhere? And similarly, like walking the property with the way that this area here is here in this field. Again, observe, interact, observe, spend time in a place, observe, walk the land. You know, there are some places out here where water tends to pool. And so I know that. Then with this, and again having multiple base maps, we can look at where does the flooding happen. And from my understanding from talking with the folks here and seeing some pictures of it, floodwaters flow in this way and then slowly kind of fill up the yard. And this is where, when it comes to making maps, that there are all kinds of different ways to put this information onto paper and make it useful. You know, I'm here with a couple of different printouts, kind of putting different things down in order to make sense of them and to track them through kind of space and time. But what you can do is look at this, and rather than having multiple maps that you draw on, you could make overlays with some tracing paper, so that, you know, you could take a piece of tracing paper, lay it over your base map, color it in with colored pencils, or make some lines, or in other ways indicate the information that you're trying to relay, and then kind of stack this information up on top of each other. Because then, you know, like with water running here, with the way that that sun angle is, means that maybe you're not getting as much sun here, so that this is going to be cool and wet. Whereas even though water pools out here in this field area, because it's relatively open, even in cool weather, this area is going to get a lot of sun. It might become wet, but you might think of it as a warmer, wet spot when you are considering microclimates on the property, that you can be working through the different ways that this information or work your way through what these different pieces of information relay to you, and what it helps you to understand by piling things together. That's where I like, you know, making these different maps, coming in and putting pieces of information down, and then kind of moving things around to try different things. One of my favorite design techniques is random assemblage, which is where I'll write down everything that I want to include on a site, or in a site, on 3x5 cards. Take everything that's already existing there, take anything that a client might have shared with me, insights or ideas that I might have, write them down on 3x5 cards, take my base map and just shuffle them together, and then just put a card down, put a card down, put a card down, and see what develops, what arises. And that way it can kind of break me out of having a set or particular idea of what it is that I want to accomplish or develop somewhere, and be able to take all these different pieces of information and build them up into a useful model to lead to what could become a finalized design. And that's where, when it comes to like knowing where this flooding is going, these willows are here because of a suggestion that I had, as well as these brambles, in order to help mitigate this flooding. The floodwaters actually rise in off of a neighbor's land and begin to fill the yard. And because of issues that had occurred before, actually because of the floodwaters flow, because the stream flows westerly across this property, that debris and other material would actually wind up coming into this yard carried by the water. And by having some of these breaks in here, the brambles really helped to stop small debris, and then just this bramble line can be walked then after a flood to pick up any trash or anything that comes through. And then these willows help to keep heavier items, like trees. There was an ATV that rolled through this space before, as well as like large children's toys, just all the stuff that gets picked up by water when flowing through properties. And so as a result of that, these kinds of pieces catch that and then act as filters. And that's one of the ways then that we help to mitigate flooding. We can't stop the flow of water through this site. Levees and dams aren't really options in this area because of the protections that the stream are under because of natural resource management. And there's also a dam further upstream for the city of Harrisburg and its water supply. And so, you know, there can't be a lot of large earth moving to occur to keep flooding from happening. So how do you creatively respond to this issue as it comes through? And this was one of the solutions that in our discussion we found. Something similar is that because there's wild space here to the west, there are that is undeveloped, and there are neighbors' spaces here to the east. This does work as an animal corridor. They've seen lots of deer here, groundhogs, plenty of birds nest in the trees, stop there on their way through. And so one of the solutions that we came up with when we think of animal life as vectors when it comes to wildlife is that rather than trying to prevent those animals from coming through the property, it was just easier for this family to plant more plants and just have, expect a loss. There was, until they died a few years ago, there were some elderberry here that were browsed by the deer and provided deer for them in these raised beds in the front yard. The tomato plants that were there, just planting an extra 2 or 3 of those, and then those animals, rather than being something seen as destructive on the landscape or as truly a negative, were then used because then the children in the home had opportunity to see those animals as they would come to the garden and feed there. And those are the kinds of solutions that I really like to look for when it comes to our possibilities as permaculture designers, because we can do things that are supportive of the other than human and really be able to use all of the tools that we have available to us to create, more bountiful spaces for the people and the life that they might find there. And, that's where I think about like all of these different things that we might have going on when it's like construction, okay? If construction crews are coming through and they're trimming trees, how can we take that from a negative and turn it into a positive? In many cases, those construction folks, you can get to leave the wood chips that they've gathered and shredded on a property so that you can use that then to mulch your beds or use it on your mulch. For pesticides, herbicides, and chemicals, a lot of times those materials don't, like the overspray from something like that, doesn't necessarily carry really far, and so we can plant windbreaks around in order to help keep those chemicals from getting to the pieces that are being made available for human use. With wildfires, probably the most important thing for a family like this is making sure that there is a sufficient fire break around their home so that if there were some kind of a wildfire, that it doesn't reach the central space and family habitation. And then also having a conversation about how do you improve that home to minimize the wildfire risks. And so one of the things that this home has is a metal roof so that there's less chance of a spark or an ember to get up under a shingle or something like that and then cause a fire. It's just one of those seamless roofs. The gutters have covers on them. Gutters are metal covers, so that if a spark were to get in there and there would be some kind of a fire that may heat up, it's less likely to melt through and get close to the house. Having covers on gutters helps prevent debris from accumulating there, so that if there are any sparks or anything that would land in those spaces, decreases the risk of there being some kind of ignition, as well as keeping that gutter space a bit more humid, a bit more wet. If there's a little bit of debris in the bottom of that cover keeps the sun off of it and can keep those materials moist. House itself, covered siding, lowest floor is block, so that if there were a fire and any trees or anything were to fall and wind up against it, the home, it's not directly against the flammable material. Now, granted, some of those things are design considerations that we couldn't consider because the home was already built, but it was something that we could look at when it comes to our mitigation processes when working on sectors, in order to see what advantages are already there and then what kind of active changes we might need to make in order to make improvements around the site. Similarly, making sure that as I say, that there's open space around the yard, around the home, so that there's lawn here, largely that the garden itself sits away from where a fire might come through. And just, a lot of these kinds of considerations that you can go through, especially when you yourself as a designer are rooted in an area and have a sense of place. You're going to have an idea of what the regular issues and problems are that are likely to arise, and so can develop a toolkit for yourself of what common mitigation practices are for any of these. When it comes to people and their roles, if we're thinking about the negative impacts that people might have, what are ways that we can change that, with a small like redirection. So I think about, like, for these folks, and they talk about the fact that this stream is fished throughout the year and that people come to it, that if there are fishermen who are likely to walk through the property, what kind of signage could you have to lead them to perhaps, a path here that gets them to a little area where they can easily get to the stream, rather than having them come like directly through where the family is. With traffic, there's not a huge flow of traffic through here, but there have been some accidents that have involved vehicles both missing a turn that comes at the end of this property, and so have actually barreled through the yard. And so when we think about that, and having that as something that has actually happened, then looking at, okay, where did they come through? Why did that happen? Well, there's a retaining wall here. And so, like a previous accident that occurred, somebody actually hit this front retaining wall directly in front of the house. But it was high enough that it didn't lead to any kind of landscape damage. So then, looking at that retaining wall does appear to be a safety feature. And so having raised beds in a garden here with a family works. Makes perfect sense. But considering that there was a vehicle that came down through here, then we don't want to have regular family use areas. So when we're thinking about our zones, maybe this becomes a zone 4, the kind of place that we might, plant some things that would be useful to us. We might put an orchard in there, recognizing that there may be some damage, or a risk of loss, and that we can visit, but then, we want to wait until there's a reduction in traffic. Listen for cars coming down the road before using this space. And then focus more then on our areas of heavier use are localized here, near the home, when we're thinking of like zone 1 and zone 2. Yeah. And at the moment, that kind of covers where my thoughts were on doing an overview of this idea of sectors and vectors, and doing some brainstorming and showing how they might work out on a base map. Before I draw today's live stream to a close, I'm going to go ahead and take a drink here, see if anybody wants to drop a question into the chat on YouTube, and then we will, see if there's anything else or draw this to a close. All right, then. Well, thank you everybody for joining me today for this continuation of the conversation on permaculture design, dropping into sectors and vectors and doing a bit of analysis with me as we looked through base maps, the zone model, and the way that that applies to our sector and vector analysis. The next live stream is going to be on Wednesday, June 16th at 8 p.m. and is going to continue the conversation on children and permaculture. Next weekend, the 18th through the 21st, we're going to have a long weekend with my kids, so I won't be doing any live streaming then, but then we'll return with the next live stream on permaculture design. Will be on Wednesday, June 23rd, again, probably at 8 p.m., but I will share an update with the Patreon community as those get scheduled, and we'll also share to the YouTube community feature. I'll post there as well once those dates are up. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can, and what is it, you have to click the bell now, I think, to receive updates. But if you're over there, then you can see those community posts if you're not on the Patreon. If you'd like to become a Patreon supporter, of course, that is patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. And yeah, I will catch all of you again soon, and thank you for joining me today.